Marcus Chen jolted awake to the weight of something warm and still pressed against his chest. His eyes snapped open in the dim security office, fluorescent lights humming overhead like dying insects. The woman in his arms was unconscious, her designer blazer torn at the shoulder, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. Her breathing was shallow, labored. For one terrifying moment, he thought she might be dying. Then, her lips moved, barely a whisper, words that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his world. Don't let them. Find the files. 6 hours earlier, Marcus had been doing what he always did during the graveyard shift at Meridian Financial Tower, the kind of invisible work that kept a 40-story glass monument to wealth functioning while its occupants slept safely in their penthouses across the city. He walked the halls with practiced silence, checking doors, monitoring cameras, ensuring that nothing disturbed the delicate ecosystem of power and money that pulsed through the building's steel veins during daylight hours. The night guard position wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. $12 an hour, health benefits after 6 months, and most importantly, a schedule that let him be home when Emma woke up for school. At 32, Marcus had learned that steady trumped dreams every single time. He had learned that lesson the hard way, through a series of failures that had stripped away every illusion he'd once held about fairness, merit, and the possibility of climbing out of the hole that poverty dug around you. Marcus Chen hadn't always been a security guard. 5 years ago, he had been Dr. Marcus Chen, emergency room physician at Philadelphia General Hospital, the kind of man who wore scrubs like armor and saved lives with the steady precision of someone born to heal. He had believed then that competence mattered more than connections, that hard work could overcome any obstacle, that the system rewarded those who served it faithfully. He was wrong about all of that. The malpractice lawsuit had come out of nowhere, a patient who died despite Marcus's best efforts, a family looking for someone to blame, and a hospital administration more interested in protecting their reputation than defending their staff. The legal battle lasted 2 years, draining his savings, his confidence, and eventually his marriage. When the dust settled, he was cleared of all wrongdoing, but his medical license was suspended pending review. His credit was destroyed, and his wife had taken their daughter 3 states away. It took him another year to get Emma back, to prove to a family court judge that he could provide a stable home despite having lost everything that had once defined him. By then, the medical review board had quietly decided that perhaps Dr. Marcus Chen didn't quite fit their vision of what a physician should be. His license was reinstated, but somehow no hospital in the tri-state area seemed to have any openings that matched his qualifications. So Marcus Chen became Marcus the Night Watchman, invisible in his navy blue uniform, walking endless halls in a building full of people who would never see him as anything more than part of the furniture. He told himself it was temporary, that he would find a way back to medicine, that this was just a detour on the road to reclaiming his life. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you had a 7-year-old daughter depending on you. Emma was asleep now in their studio apartment in South Philadelphia, curled up in the narrow bed they shared, her math homework completed and stacked neatly on the card table that served as both dining room and desk. She never complained about their cramped quarters, about the thin walls that let in every argument from the neighbors, about the fact that her dad worked nights and slept during the day when other fathers were taking their kids to soccer practice. Emma was remarkable that way, accepting their circumstances with a resilience that both amazed and broke Marcus's heart. She was too young to remember their old life, the house in the suburbs with the fenced yard and the golden retriever, the family vacations and the college fund that had evaporated along with everything else. To her, this was normal. Her dad was a security guard who read medical journals on his breaks and helped her with science projects that were probably more advanced than they should have been for a second grader. The Meridian Financial Tower stood like a monument to everything Marcus had lost. During the day, it hummed with the activity of wealth managers, investment advisors, and corporate executives who moved money around in ways that generated more money, an endless cycle of prosperity that seemed to exist in a different universe from the one where Marcus worried about whether the rent check would clear. At night, the building belonged to people like him, The cleaning crew, the maintenance staff, the security guards who kept watch over billions of dollars in assets while earning barely enough to keep their own lives from falling apart. There was Maria from El Salvador, who cleaned the executive floors and sent half her paycheck home to support her elderly parents. There was James, the maintenance supervisor, who had been trying to get his electrician's license for 3 years but couldn't afford to take time off for the required training. They were ghosts in this world of glass and steel, visible only when something went wrong, invisible the rest of the time. Marcus had been walking his rounds on the 35th floor when he heard the commotion from the stairwell. Raised voices, the sound of something heavy hitting the concrete steps, then an abrupt silence that made his skin prickle with unease. He had learned to trust his instincts during his years in the emergency room, that sixth sense that told him when something was seriously wrong, even before the evidence was clear. He moved toward the stairwell entrance, his hand automatically reaching for the radio clipped to his belt. Protocol said to call it in first, to let the police handle anything that might be dangerous. But the ER doctor in him overrode the security guard's caution. Someone might be hurt, someone might need help that couldn't wait for backup to arrive. The stairwell was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners between floors. Marcus climbed quickly, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. He found her on the landing between the 36th and 37th floors, crumpled against the metal railing like a broken doll. Even in the poor light, he could see that she was someone important. Her clothes screamed money, from the perfectly tailored charcoal suit to the Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek bun that had come partially undone, strands falling across a face that was pale and still in a way that made his medical training kick in immediately. Marcus dropped to his knees beside her, his fingers automatically finding her wrist to check for a pulse. It was there, steady but weak. Her breathing was shallow, and there was a gash on her forehead that was bleeding freely. Head injury, possible concussion, potentially serious internal trauma if she had fallen down the stairs. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He reached for his radio to call for an ambulance, but her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength for someone who appeared unconscious. Her eyes opened, unfocused, and filled with something that looked like terror. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No hospitals, no police." Marcus stared down at her, his medical training warring with the desperation in her voice. "Ma'am, you're injured. You need medical attention." "Please," she said, trying to sit up and immediately wincing in pain. "I can't. They can't know I was here. Not tonight." "Who can't know?" Marcus asked, but she was already losing consciousness again, her grip on his wrist loosening as her eyes rolled back. He made a decision that would have horrified his old colleagues at Philadelphia General. Instead of calling for help, he gathered the injured woman in his arms and carried her to the security office on the 34th floor. It was a small room filled with monitors and filing cabinets, hardly an appropriate place for medical care, but it was private and secure, somewhere he could assess her injuries without the complications of hospitals and police reports that she seemed so desperate to avoid. The security office had a small couch where guards sometimes caught naps during their breaks. Marcus laid her down carefully, grabbing the first aid kit from the wall and a bottle of water from the mini refrigerator in the corner. The head wound looked worse than it probably was, the way scalp injuries always did, bleeding freely but not necessarily deep. He cleaned it as best he could with the limited supplies available, then checked her pupils with the small flashlight from his belt. Equal and reactive, which was good. No obvious signs of serious brain injury, though he knew that could change quickly with head trauma. Her pulse was stronger now, her breathing more regular. Whatever had happened to her, she was stable for the moment, but stable didn't mean safe, and Marcus found himself wondering what kind of trouble this woman was in that made her more afraid of getting help than of bleeding to death in a stairwell. He had seen plenty of well-dressed people in the ER over the years, executives and professionals who thought their money and status would get them special treatment. Some of them were decent people who had simply never had to navigate the world without a safety net. Others were the kind of entitled jerks who treated medical staff like servants and demanded immediate attention for minor ailments while genuinely sick people waited in the hallway. This woman felt different somehow, even unconscious, even vulnerable. There was something about her that suggested competence, intelligence, the kind of controlled power that came from real achievement rather than inherited privilege. Marcus found himself studying her face, trying to place where he might have seen her before. She was beautiful in an understated way, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jawline that spoke of determination and will. Her hands were manicured but not pampered, with small calluses that suggested she did more than just sign papers and attend meetings. There was a small scar on her chin that looked old, the kind of mark that came from childhood accidents or teenage rebellions. For 2 hours, Marcus sat in the uncomfortable office chair, monitoring her condition and trying to piece together what might have happened. The building was supposed to be secure after hours, accessible only to authorized personnel and the cleaning crew. The stairwells were locked from the inside above the 30th floor, requiring a special access card that only senior executives and security staff possessed, which meant that either this woman belonged here or someone had let her in. And if she belonged here, why was she so afraid of being found? The questions multiplied like cells dividing, each answer leading to more uncertainty. Marcus checked the security monitors, scrolling through the footage from the past few hours, but the stairwell cameras only covered the main landings, not the area where he had found her. The elevator logs showed normal activity until about midnight, then nothing unusual until the cleaning crew arrived at 2 a.m. It was just after 3 when she stirred again, her eyelids fluttering open as consciousness slowly returned. Marcus leaned forward, watching for signs of confusion or disorientation that might indicate serious brain injury. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. She blinked several times, her eyes focusing on his face with an intensity that made him suddenly self-conscious. "You're not security," she said, her voice clearer now but still weak. "Actually, I am," Marcus replied, gesturing to his uniform. "Night shift. I found you in the stairwell." "No," she said, struggling to sit up despite his gentle attempt to keep her lying down. "You're not just security. The way you cleaned the wound, checked my pupils. You have medical training." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Most people wouldn't have noticed those details, especially not someone who had just suffered a head injury. "I took some first aid courses," he said, which was technically true, even if it left out the medical degree and 5 years of emergency room experience. She studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing far more than he wanted to reveal. "What's your name?" Marcus Chen." "Well, Marcus Chen," she said, finally managing to sit upright on the couch. "I'm Victoria Sterling, and I think someone just tried to kill me." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, heavy with implications that Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to understand. Victoria Sterling. The name was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. Someone important enough to have enemies, apparently. Someone whose presence in this building at 3 in the morning was significant enough that people might want her dead. "Who would want to kill you?" Marcus asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Victoria laughed, a sound without humor. "The list is probably longer than you'd think. But tonight I was supposed to be at a charity gala downtown. Black tie, $500 a plate dinner, all the usual suspects writing checks to feel better about the world they're helping to destroy." She touched the bandage on her forehead gingerly. "Instead, I'm here because I received a message this afternoon. Anonymous, untraceable. Someone claiming to have evidence about what really happened to the Hartwell Pension Fund." Marcus didn't recognize the name, but Victoria's expression suggested it was significant. "What happened to it?" "It disappeared," she said simply. $87 million in retirement savings for the employees of Hartwell Manufacturing, gone overnight when the company went bankrupt 3 years ago. The official investigation concluded it was poor investment decisions and market volatility. Case closed, nothing to see here. But you don't believe that. "I know that's not what happened," Victoria said, her voice hardening. "Because I was the forensic accountant who worked on the original investigation. I found evidence of systematic fraud, money being siphoned off through shell companies and offshore accounts. My report was buried, the investigation was shut down, and I was quietly reassigned to other cases." Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place, a pattern of corruption and cover-up that was depressingly familiar. And tonight someone claimed to have proof of what you found. More than proof, Victoria said. The original files from my investigation, the ones that supposedly were destroyed in a server crash. Someone has them, and they wanted to meet here, in this building, to hand them over. Why here? Victoria's smile was grim. Because this building houses the corporate offices of Meridian Financial, the company that managed the Hartwell Pension Fund, the company that profited handsomely when that fund disappeared. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. If Victoria was right, if there really was evidence of massive fraud hidden somewhere in this building, then her presence here wasn't just dangerous for her. It was dangerous for anyone who helped her, anyone who knew what she was looking for, including a security guard who was supposed to be invisible. You need to leave, Marcus said quietly. Whatever you're involved in, it's way above my pay grade. I can't leave, Victoria replied. Not without those files. Do you understand what $87 million means to the people who lost it? Families who worked their entire lives believing they would have something to retire on, only to discover that their money had been stolen by the very people they trusted to protect it. Marcus understood better than she knew. He had seen those families in the ER, elderly patients who couldn't afford their medications, who delayed seeking treatment because they couldn't pay for it, who sometimes died because they chose between medical care and keeping the lights on. Even if you find these files, he said, what makes you think anyone will listen this time? Because this time I won't be working within the system, Victoria said. This time I'll take it straight to the press, to the FBI, to anyone who will listen. Sometimes the only way to fight corruption is to drag it into the light where everyone can see it. Marcus looked at this woman, this Victoria Sterling, who spoke about justice with the kind of conviction that most people reserved for religion, and felt something stirring in his chest that he thought he had buried years ago. The idealism that had driven him to become a doctor, the belief that one person could make a difference if they were willing to pay the price. He had paid that price once already, lost everything because he had tried to do the right thing in a system that rewarded compliance over conscience. He couldn't afford to make that mistake again, not when Emma was depending on him. But as he looked at Victoria Sterling, injured and alone and fighting a battle against forces that could destroy her as easily as they had destroyed him, Marcus found himself remembering why he had become a doctor in the first place, not for the money or the status, but because sometimes people needed help, and sometimes you were the only one who could provide it. The files, he said quietly. Where are they supposed to be? Victoria's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to ask. The 37th floor. Executive conference room. There's supposed to be a package hidden behind the portrait of Meridian's founder. Marcus knew the room she was talking about. He had walked past it hundreds of times during his rounds, a shrine to corporate power with its leather furniture and oil paintings and windows that looked out over the city like the view from Mount Olympus. And you believe this mysterious contact of yours actually left something there? I don't know, Victoria admitted, but I have to find out. Those people deserve justice, Marcus. They deserve to know the truth about what happened to their life savings. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against his own hard-earned survival instincts. Getting involved in corporate conspiracy was exactly the kind of thing that could destroy what little stability he had managed to rebuild, but walking away meant letting Victoria face whatever dangers were waiting for her alone. And despite everything that had happened to him, despite all the lessons about keeping his head down and staying invisible, Marcus discovered that he couldn't do that. The 37th floor is restricted access, he said finally. You'd need an executive key card to get into that conference room. I have one, Victoria said, reaching into her jacket and pulling out a plastic card. My contact left it for me along with the meeting instructions. Marcus stared at the card, recognizing it as the same type carried by the senior executives whose offices he guarded every night. Someone with serious access had set this meeting up, someone who knew the building's security systems well enough to navigate them without being detected. This could be a trap, he said. I know. You could be walking into something that gets you killed. I know that too. Marcus stood up from his chair, his decision crystallizing with the kind of clarity that came when you stopped fighting against what you knew was right and simply accepted it. Then I guess we'd better make sure that doesn't happen, he said. Victoria looked up at him with something that might have been surprise or might have been gratitude. We? You're not going up there alone, Marcus said. "Whatever's waiting on the 37th floor, you're going to need backup, and I'm the only backup you've got." For a moment, Victoria Sterling, this woman who spoke about justice and corruption, with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard, looked almost vulnerable. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Marcus thought about Emma, asleep in their cramped apartment, trusting him to make the choices that would keep them safe and stable. He thought about all the compromises he had made, all the times he had chosen security over principle, survival over standing up for what was right. "Because," he said quietly, "sometimes doing nothing is the same as being complicit, and I've done nothing for long enough." Victoria nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity. "Then let's go find those files." They took the elevator up to the 37th floor, the highest level of the building except for the executive penthouse that housed Meridian's CEO. The hallway was darker than the lower floors, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows between the mahogany doors and brass nameplate that marked the offices of the company's senior leadership. The executive conference room was at the end of the hall, its double doors imposing enough to discourage casual visitors. Marcus used Victoria's key card to unlock the door, and they stepped into a space that felt more like a museum than a meeting room. The walls were lined with portraits of Meridian's leadership stretching back to the company's founding in 1953. Stern-faced men in dark suits who stared down from their gilded frames with the kind of authority that came from controlling other people's money. The conference table was a massive slab of polished wood that could seat 20 people, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. The portrait of Meridian's founder, Charles Meridian himself, hung behind the head of the table like an icon in a cathedral of capitalism. He was a distinguished man with silver hair and cold eyes, the kind of person who had probably never worried about making rent or whether his child would have enough to eat. Victoria walked directly to the portrait, running her hands along the ornate frame. "There's supposed to be something here," she murmured, searching for any kind of hidden compartment or mechanism. Marcus kept watch by the door, listening for any sound that might indicate they weren't alone on this floor. The building felt different at night, emptied of the energy and noise that filled it during business hours. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow potentially dangerous. "Got it," Victoria said quietly. She had found a small lever hidden behind the portrait's frame, and when she pressed it, a section of the wall swung open to reveal a shallow compartment. Inside was a manila envelope, thick with documents and what looked like several data storage devices. Victoria reached for the envelope with trembling hands, and Marcus could see the hope and fear warring in her expression. "Is it what you expected?" he asked. Victoria opened the envelope and pulled out the first few pages, her eyes scanning them quickly. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This is everything. Bank records, wire transfer receipts, correspondence between Meridian executives and the shell companies. It's all here." She looked up at Marcus, her face flushed with excitement and vindication. "Do you know what this means? This proves everything I suspected about the Hartwell case. We can expose the whole network, recover the stolen money, maybe even prevent it from happening to other pension funds." Marcus felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being part of something important, something that mattered beyond the narrow confines of personal survival. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that justice was possible, that the system could be held accountable for its failures. That was when the lights went out. The conference room plunged into absolute darkness, emergency lighting kicking in a few seconds later to cast everything in an eerie red glow. Marcus heard Victoria gasp, then the sound of papers rustling as she hastily stuffed the documents back into the envelope. "Someone's here," Marcus said quietly, his hand moving automatically to the radio on his belt, before he remembered that calling for help might put Victoria in even more danger. They could hear footsteps in the hallway outside, multiple sets moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military or law enforcement training. Marcus counted at least 4 distinct sets of footfalls, all heading directly toward the conference room. "Is there another way out of here?" Victoria whispered. Marcus thought quickly about the building's layout. Emergency stairwell at the far end of the hall, but we'd have to get past whoever's coming. The footsteps stopped just outside the conference room door. Marcus could see shadows moving under the gap at the bottom of the door, figures positioning themselves on either side of the entrance. "Ms. Sterling," a voice called through the door, calm and professional. "We know you're in there. We'd like to talk." Victoria looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "They're not here to talk," she whispered. The door handle turned slowly, and Marcus realized that whoever was out there had their own key card, their own access to this supposedly secure floor. This wasn't a random break-in or a case of mistaken identity. This was planned, coordinated, professional. And Victoria had been right to be afraid. Marcus made another split-second decision, the kind that had served him well in the ER when seconds meant the difference between life and death. He grabbed Victoria's hand and pulled her toward the far corner of the room, where a service entrance led to a maintenance corridor that connected to the emergency stairwell. They made it halfway across the room before the main door burst open and figures in dark clothing poured into the conference room. Marcus caught a glimpse of tactical gear, weapons, faces hidden behind masks before he shoved Victoria through the service entrance and slammed the door behind them. The maintenance corridor was narrow and poorly lit, filled with pipes and electrical conduits that made running treacherous. Behind them, Marcus could hear shouting, the sound of furniture being overturned as their pursuers searched the conference room. "This way," Marcus whispered, leading Victoria toward the emergency stairwell. His knowledge of the building's layout, gained through months of walking these halls in the dark, was their only advantage now. They reached the stairwell and started down, taking the steps 2 at a time while trying to stay quiet. 36 floors to the ground level, where Marcus could get Victoria to his car and away from whatever forces had been mobilized to stop her. They had made it down 3 floors when they heard the stairwell door above them crash open, followed by the sound of heavy boots on concrete as their pursuers gave chase. "Faster," Marcus urged, grabbing Victoria's hand to steady her as she stumbled on the unfamiliar stairs. They were on the 32nd floor when Victoria suddenly stopped, doubling over in pain. The head injury and the adrenaline were taking their toll, and Marcus could see that she was reaching the end of her endurance. "I can't," she gasped. "I need to rest." Marcus looked up the stairwell, calculating how much time they had before their pursuers caught up. Not enough, especially if Victoria couldn't maintain their pace. He made another decision, one that went against every survival instinct he had developed over the past few years. Instead of continuing down toward the exit, he led Victoria through the door into the 32nd floor hallway. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Buying us time," Marcus replied, leading her toward his security office. "They'll expect us to head for the exits. We're going to hide." The security office was small and cluttered, definitely not designed to conceal 2 people for any length of time. But it had one advantage: multiple monitors connected to the building's security camera system, which would let them track their pursuers' movements. Marcus locked the door behind them and helped Victoria to the small couch where he had first treated her injuries. She was pale again, the stress and exertion making her head wound bleed fresh. "Who are those people?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Marcus replied, studying the security monitors. "But they had access to the building, professional equipment, and they knew exactly where to find you. This wasn't some random corporate security team." On the monitors, Marcus could see their pursuers moving methodically through the building, checking each floor, each possible hiding place. They moved with military precision, covering each other's movements, communicating through what appeared to be tactical radio systems. "Government?" Victoria asked, following his gaze to the monitors. "Maybe, or private military contractors. Either way, they're serious about stopping you from getting those documents to the public." Victoria clutched the manila envelope, too, her chest like armor. "Then we have to make sure that doesn't happen." Marcus looked at this woman who had stumbled into his quiet, invisible life and turned it upside down in the space of a few hours. Victoria Sterling, who fought corruption with the kind of moral courage that most people only talked about, who was willing to risk everything to expose the truth about stolen pension funds and ruined lives. She reminded him of who he used to be, before life had taught him that idealism was a luxury he couldn't afford. "There's something I haven't told you," Marcus said quietly. Victoria looked up at him, waiting. "I'm not just a security guard. I used to be a doctor. Emergency medicine. I lost my license after a malpractice suit, lost everything trying to fight it. What happened? Marcus was quiet for a moment, remembering the cascade of events that had destroyed his old life. A patient died. Overdose, brought in too late for me to save him. But he was the son of a city councilman, and the family needed someone to blame. The hospital chose to protect itself rather than stand by me. That's horrible. The point is, Marcus continued, I learned what happens when you try to fight a system that's determined to protect itself. It destroys you. It takes everything you've worked for and grinds it into dust. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. But you're still here. You survived. Barely. And only because I learned to keep my head down, to stay invisible, to never again put myself in a position where powerful people might see me as a threat. Then why are you helping me now? Marcus looked at the monitors, watching the armed figures systematically searching the building for them. Because some things are more important than staying safe. And because I have a daughter who deserves to grow up in a world where justice actually means something. Victoria smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her all night. What's her name? Emma, she's 7. Does she know what her father used to do? That he saved lives? She knows I help people, Marcus said. That's enough. On the monitors, they watched as their pursuers reached the 30th floor, still moving methodically but showing signs of frustration as their search turned up nothing. Marcus estimated they had maybe 20 minutes before the search pattern brought them to the security office. We need to get out of the building, he said, but they'll have the exits covered. What about the roof? Victoria asked. Marcus shook his head. Dead end. No way down except through the building. Then what do you suggest? Marcus studied the monitors, thinking about everything he knew about this building's layout, its hidden spaces, its vulnerabilities. There was one possibility, risky and unconventional, but it might work. The parking garage, he said, sub-basement level. There's a service tunnel that connects to the building across the street. It was built when they renovated this place 5 years ago, part of the fire safety upgrades. You think we can make it there? Marcus looked at the determination in Victoria's eyes, the way she held those documents like they were worth dying for, and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to do something that mattered. We're going to find out, he said. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Single dad security guard woke up with injured CEO in his arms. What she said left him speechless. The service tunnel beneath Meridian Financial Tower smelled like rust and forgotten corners, a narrow concrete passage that connected the underground parking structures of 2 adjacent buildings. Marcus led the way with his security flashlight, its beam cutting through darkness that felt thick enough to touch. Behind him, Victoria clutched the manila envelope with evidence that could topple a corporate empire if they lived long enough to use it. How much farther? Victoria whispered, her voice echoing off the damp walls. Another 100 yards, Marcus replied, checking his watch. They had been underground for 20 minutes, long enough for their pursuers to realize they weren't hiding in the building anymore. There's an exit that comes up in the lobby of the Hartwell Memorial Building. Victoria stumbled slightly on the uneven concrete. Hartwell, same name as the pension fund. Not a coincidence, Marcus said, steadying her with his free hand. Thomas Hartwell built half the financial district before he died. His son Richard ran the manufacturing company into the ground. You know a lot about local business history for a security guard? Marcus was quiet for a moment, remembering his old life when he had time to read newspapers and follow financial news, when he cared about things beyond just making it through each day. I used to pay attention to the world outside my immediate survival. They reached the end of the tunnel, where a service ladder led up to street level. Marcus climbed first, testing the heavy metal cover that protected the exit. It opened with a groan of protest, revealing the empty lobby of a building that had been abandoned for 2 years, ever since the Hartwell manufacturing bankruptcy had left the memorial building without a tenant. Marcus helped Victoria up into the lobby, a cavernous space filled with shadows and the echoes of better times. Dust motes danced in the moonlight that filtered through tall windows, and their footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the marble floor. My car is 3 blocks from here, Marcus said. Once we're mobile, we can figure out our next move. Victoria looked around the empty lobby, her expression thoughtful. This building, it's where Thomas Hartwell had his offices, isn't it? Before he moved to the bigger space downtown. How do you know that? Because I spent months researching the Hartwell family when I was investigating the pension fund disappearance. Thomas Hartwell wasn't just a businessman. He was an idealist who believed companies had obligations to their workers. He established the pension fund in 1967, one of the first fully funded retirement programs in the state. Marcus could hear something like reverence in her voice. You admire him. I admire what he stood for. The idea that success means more than just profit, that businesses have responsibilities to the communities that support them. Victoria clutched the envelope tighter. His son Richard inherited the company, but not the principles. When Hartwell Manufacturing started losing money, Richard saw the pension fund as a convenient source of operating capital. And Meridian Financial helped him steal it. Meridian didn't just help, Victoria said, her voice hardening. They orchestrated the whole thing, created the shell companies, managed the offshore transfers, then covered their tracks when the bankruptcy made it impossible to recover the money. They made their way through the empty lobby toward the street exit, but Marcus found himself stopping in front of a large portrait that dominated one wall. Thomas Hartwell, painted in oils sometime in the 1970s, looked down at them with eyes that seemed to hold both wisdom and sadness, as if he had foreseen what would become of his legacy. $87 million, Victoria said quietly, standing beside Marcus. That's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. That's Margaret Chen, 68 years old, who worked in the factory for 43 years and now cleans office buildings at night because her pension disappeared. That's Robert Martinez, who had a heart attack and can't afford the medication he needs. That's hundreds of families who did everything right and still lost everything. Marcus looked at her sharply. Chen? Margaret Chen works for your company? Victoria nodded. Third shift cleaning crew. I've seen her in the building. She's your mother, isn't she? The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His mother had never told him she worked at Meridian Financial, had never mentioned cleaning the offices of the very company he guarded every night. Margaret Chen, who had worked double shifts for years to help pay for his medical school, who had sacrificed her own comfort to give him opportunities she had never had. She lost her pension too, Marcus said, the pieces clicking into place. Hartwell Manufacturing. She worked there before she started cleaning buildings. I'm sorry, Victoria said softly. I should have realized. No. Marcus turned away from the portrait, his jaw set with new determination. You shouldn't have to apologize for my mother having to work 3 jobs at 70 because some executives decided her retirement fund looked like easy money. They walked in silence for a moment, the weight of personal connection adding new urgency to their mission. This wasn't just about abstract justice anymore. This was about Margaret Chen and hundreds of people like her, invisible workers whose lives had been casually destroyed by men in expensive suits who would never feel the consequences of their actions. Marcus's car was a 10-year-old Honda with a dented bumper and a passenger door that stuck, the kind of reliable transportation that got you from point A to point B without attracting attention. He helped Victoria into the passenger seat, noting that her head injury seemed to be affecting her balance more than she wanted to admit. Where to? He asked, starting the engine. I need to get these documents to someone who can act on them, Victoria said. The FBI, the State Attorney General's office, maybe a journalist who specializes in financial crimes. Marcus pulled away from the curb, checking his mirrors for any sign of pursuit. At 4:30 in the morning? You're right. We need somewhere safe to wait until business hours. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I have a cabin about an hour north of the city. It's not much, but it's private and off the grid. We could review the documents there, plan our approach. Marcus glanced at her, noting the exhaustion in her voice, the way she held herself as if movement caused pain. You need medical attention. That head injury could be more serious than it looks. I'm fine. No, you're not. Marcus's voice carried the authority of his medical training. You've got a probable concussion, possible internal bleeding, and you've been running on adrenaline for hours. When that wears off, you're going to crash hard. Victoria looked at him with new attention. You really were a doctor, weren't you? Marcus focused on the road ahead, the city lights blurring past as they headed toward the interstate. Emergency medicine, 5 years at Philadelphia General before everything fell apart. What really happened? With the malpractice suit? The question hung in the air between them, touching on wounds that Marcus had spent years trying to heal. He had told the basic story to Victoria earlier, but not the deeper truth, not the personal cost of standing up for what he believed was right. The patient who died was named David Morrison, Marcus said finally. 22 years old, city councilman's son. Brought in at 3 a.m. with what looked like a drug overdose. By the time he reached us, he was already in cardiac arrest. Marcus could still see David Morrison's face, pale and lifeless on the emergency room table, could still remember the desperate 45 minutes they had spent trying to bring him back. We did everything we could. CPR, defibrillation, emergency drugs. But he had been down too long before the ambulance found him. The brain damage was too extensive. That's not your fault. No, it wasn't. But David Morrison had been at a party hosted by the son of Meridian Financial's CEO. There were a lot of important people there, people with reputations to protect. The official story was that David had taken drugs he brought himself, that his death was the result of personal poor judgment. Marcus turned onto the interstate, the road stretching ahead like a ribbon of possibility. But David's blood work showed something different. The drugs in his system weren't street drugs. They were prescription medications, powerful stuff that shouldn't have been available at a college party. Someone supplied them. Someone with access to controlled substances, someone who needed to make sure that if anything went wrong, there would be a scapegoat ready to take the blame. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. They framed you. They tried to. The malpractice suit claimed that I had failed to recognize the signs of prescription drug abuse, that my negligence had contributed to David's death. It was bullshit, but it was expensive bullshit. Fighting it meant lawyers I couldn't afford, expert witnesses, depositions that kept me out of the ER for months at a time. But you were cleared. Eventually. But by then the damage was done. The medical community is small, and reputation is everything. Even being accused of malpractice was enough to make hospital administrators nervous about hiring me. Add in the fact that I had been asking uncomfortable questions about David Morrison's death, and suddenly I became unemployable. Marcus could see Victoria processing this information, understanding the parallels between his story and what was happening to her now. That's why you lost everything. Because you wouldn't let it go. Because I couldn't let it go, Marcus corrected. David Morrison died because someone with power and money decided his life was expendable. I couldn't prove it then, but I knew it was true, and I couldn't just accept that and move on with my life. What happened to your family? The question touched on the deepest wound of all, the price that Marcus's principles had extracted not just from him, but from the people he loved most. My wife Sarah tried to understand at first. She supported the fight to clear my name, even when it meant using our savings for legal fees. But as the months dragged on and the bills piled up and I couldn't find work, she started to see my principles as selfishness. Marcus remembered the arguments, the gradual erosion of trust and affection, the way love could curdle into resentment when stress and financial pressure overwhelmed everything else. She took Emma and moved to her mother's house in Ohio, filed for divorce, claimed I was an unfit parent because I couldn't provide stable income. It took me 2 years and every penny I could scrape together to get joint custody. I'm sorry. The worst part was that she wasn't wrong. My need to fight for justice, to prove that David Morrison deserved better, it did hurt Emma. It did make me a less stable parent than I should have been. They drove in silence for a while, the city giving way to suburbs and then to the rural countryside north of Philadelphia. Victoria gave directions to her cabin, a small retreat that she had inherited from her grandmother, tucked away in the mountains where cell phone coverage was spotty and internet access was a luxury rather than a necessity. Why do you do it? Marcus asked eventually. The forensic accounting, the investigation work. It's not exactly a path to wealth and security. Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since they had met in the stairwell. Because numbers don't lie, even when people do. Bank records, transfer receipts, audit trails, they leave fingerprints that can't be erased. And because someone has to stand up for the people who can't hire expensive lawyers and forensic accountants of their own. Like the Hartwell pensioners. Like your mother, Victoria said softly. Like all the Margaret Chens of the world who worked their whole lives trusting that the system would protect them, only to discover that the system was designed to protect the people who were stealing from them. Marcus found himself studying Victoria's profile in the dim light from the dashboard, seeing past the expensive clothes and polished exterior to the fierce intelligence and moral conviction that drove her. She reminded him of who he used to be before life had taught him that idealism was a luxury he couldn't afford. But maybe that was the wrong lesson. Maybe the real tragedy wasn't that he had lost everything fighting for justice, but that he had given up fighting at all. "Tell me about Emma," Victoria said, changing the subject. Marcus felt his expression soften immediately. "She's 7, smart as hell, funny, kind to everyone she meets even when they don't deserve it. She wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up because she thinks all animals deserve someone to take care of them. She sounds wonderful. She's the best thing I've ever done, the only thing I've done that really matters." Marcus paused, thinking about Emma sleeping safely in their small apartment, trusting him to come home in the morning like he always did. "She doesn't know about my medical background. As far as she's concerned, I've always been a security guard." "Why haven't you told her?" "Because I don't want her to see me as someone who failed, someone who had something important and lost it. I want her to see me as someone who does his job well, who provides for his family, who doesn't make promises he can't keep." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Or maybe you don't want to see yourself that way." The observation hit closer to home than Marcus was comfortable admitting. For years he had defined himself by his losses, by the things that had been taken from him, rather than the things he had preserved. His relationship with Emma, his integrity, his willingness to help people even when it cost him something. "You saved my life tonight," Victoria said. "Not just from whoever was chasing us, but in that stairwell when you found me injured. You made a choice to help someone who needed it, even though you had no reason to trust me or believe my story. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No, they wouldn't. Most people would have called security and stayed out of it. You chose to get involved because it was the right thing to do." They reached the turnoff for Victoria's cabin, a narrow dirt road that wound through thick woods. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating pine trees and rocky outcroppings that seemed to close in around them like protective walls. "There's something I need to tell you," Victoria said as they pulled up to a small log cabin nestled in a clearing. "About why I was really at Meridian tonight." Marcus turned off the engine and looked at her. "I thought you were meeting your anonymous contact." "I was, but the contact wasn't anonymous to me. I know who sent me those files." Victoria took a deep breath. It was David Morrison. The words hit Marcus like a lightning strike. "That's impossible. David Morrison is dead. David Morrison the person is dead, but David Morrison the digital identity is very much alive." Victoria pulled out her phone, scrolling through encrypted messages. "Someone has been using his old email account, his social media profiles, his digital fingerprint to investigate the same corruption that killed him." Marcus stared at the phone screen, seeing messages that appeared to come from a dead man. Who would do that? Someone who loved him. Someone who never believed the official story about his death. Someone who has spent the last 5 years methodically gathering evidence about the people responsible. His family? His sister, Elena Morrison. She's a computer security specialist, works for a government contractor in D.C. She's been using David's digital identity as a way to access information that would be blocked to her own name. Marcus felt the world shifting around him, connections forming that he had never imagined. She's been investigating Meridian Financial. She's been investigating everyone who was at that party the night David died. The Meridian CEO's son, the other guests, the people who supplied the drugs that killed her brother. And what she found led her to the Hartwell pension fund fraud. Victoria showed Marcus the messages on her phone, a months-long correspondence between Elena Morrison and Victoria Sterling about corporate corruption, stolen pension funds, and the death of a young man who had stumbled into something much bigger than a college party. David Morrison was studying business and finance, Victoria continued. He was working on a senior thesis about pension fund management. Elena thinks he discovered the Hartwell fraud and was going to expose it. She thinks that's why he was killed. Marcus sat in the dark cabin, processing this information and its implications for everything he thought he knew about David Morrison's death. You think someone murdered him to keep him quiet? I think someone gave him drugs that were designed to kill him, then made sure that anyone who tried to investigate his death would be discredited and destroyed. Victoria looked directly at Marcus. I think they used you as a scapegoat to cover up a murder. The revelation hung between them like a bridge they would either cross together or be separated by forever. Marcus thought about the 5 years he had spent blaming himself for not being able to save David Morrison, the way that failure had poisoned his confidence and destroyed his career. If Victoria was right, if David Morrison had been murdered to cover up the Hartwell fraud, then everything Marcus had lost had been the price of someone else's crimes. The files Elena sent, Marcus said quietly, they're not just about the pension fund. They're about all of it, the fraud, the cover-up, the people who died to keep it quiet. David Morrison, a factory worker named William Chen who was asking questions about missing pension payments, a journalist who was investigating Meridian's business practices. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. William Chen. Was he related to Margaret Chen? Victoria nodded sadly. Her husband, Emma's grandfather. He died in what was reported as an industrial accident 6 months before the pension fund disappeared. But Elena found evidence that he had been meeting with other Hartwell workers, organizing them to demand an audit of their pension fund. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. William Chen, asking uncomfortable questions about pension fund management. David Morrison, investigating those same questions for his senior thesis. Both dead within months of each other, both deaths written off as accidents or personal failures. And Marcus, the doctor who had tried to save David Morrison's life, destroyed professionally to make sure no one would listen if he started asking the wrong questions. They killed my wife's father, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. They killed him to steal money from his friends and neighbors. I'm sorry, Marcus. I know this is a lot to process. Marcus got out of the car and walked toward the cabin, needing space to absorb the magnitude of what Victoria had told him. The night air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of running water. Above them, stars shone with the clarity that only came far from city lights, indifferent to human suffering and human justice. Behind him, he heard Victoria getting out of the car, her movements careful and deliberate as the adrenaline that had sustained her began to wear off. When he turned back, she was leaning against the car, holding the manila envelope like a lifeline. What's in those files? Marcus asked. What did Elena find? Bank records showing the systematic theft of pension funds over a 3-year period. Correspondence between Meridian executives and shell company operators. Evidence of bribes paid to city officials to stop investigations. And most importantly, proof that William Chen and David Morrison were both murdered because they got too close to the truth. Marcus looked at this woman who had stumbled into his life and turned it upside down in the space of a few hours, carrying evidence that could expose the people responsible for his family's destruction. Victoria Sterling, who fought corruption with the same moral courage that had once driven him to become a doctor. If we do this, he said, if we expose all of this, they'll try to destroy us the same way they destroyed David Morrison and William Chen. I know. They'll go after Emma, after my mother, after anyone we care about. I know that too. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the choice in front of him. He could walk away, go back to his quiet and visible life as a security guard, protect the fragile stability he had built for himself and his daughter. Or he could fight, risk everything again for the possibility of justice for the people who had been wronged. There's something else you should know, Victoria said softly, about why I'm really doing this. Marcus waited. My grandmother worked for Hartwell Manufacturing. 40 years on the assembly line, never missed a day of work, never complained about the conditions or the pay. She raised me after my parents died, worked double shifts to pay for my education. Victoria's voice grew thick with emotion. She died 3 months after the pension fund disappeared, the stress of losing her retirement, of not knowing how she would survive. It triggered a heart attack, She died believing she had been a fool to trust a system that never cared about people like her. Marcus understood then why Victoria fought with such fierce determination, why she was willing to risk everything to expose the truth about stolen pension funds and murdered whistleblowers. This wasn't just about abstract justice. This was personal. "So what do we do?" he asked. Victoria straightened up, her exhaustion replaced by renewed purpose. "We go inside. We review these files, and we build a case so airtight that not even Meridian Financial's lawyers can make it disappear. And then we make sure that everyone knows what happened to William Chen and David Morrison and all the other people who died, because they cared more about right and wrong than about profit and loss." Marcus looked up at the stars, thinking about Emma sleeping safely in their apartment, trusting him to come home in the morning. He thought about his mother, cleaning office buildings at 70 because her pension had been stolen. He thought about David Morrison and William Chen and all. The other people who had paid the ultimate price for caring about justice. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. And then Marcus Chen, former emergency room physician turned night security guard, made his choice. "Let's go expose some killers," he said. Inside the cabin, by the light of an old kerosene lamp, Marcus and Victoria spread the contents of Elena Morrison's files across a rough wooden table. Bank records, transfer receipts, email correspondence, and death certificates painted a picture of systematic corruption that stretched back more than 5 years. "Look at this," Victoria said, pointing to a series of wire transfers. $17.3 million moved from the Hartwell Pension Fund to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, the same week that William Chen filed a formal complaint with the State Labor Department. Marcus studied the dates, seeing the timeline of theft and murder laid out in black and white. "And this," he said, indicating a death certificate, shows William Chen died in an industrial accident just 3 days after the money was transferred. "Accident," Victoria said with bitter irony. A machine that had been safely operated for 15 years suddenly malfunctioned and crushed the one man who was asking questions about missing pension funds. They worked through the files methodically, Marcus's medical training helping him organize the evidence with the same systematic precision he had once used to diagnose complex cases. Each document built on the others, creating a narrative of corruption that was impossible to dismiss or explain away. "Elena Morrison is brilliant," Victoria said, holding up a printout of financial records. She tracked the stolen money through 6 different shell companies in 4 different countries. Most of it ended up in personal accounts controlled by Meridian executives. Marcus looked at the names on the accounts, recognizing some of them from the brass nameplates he had walked past every night for months. Richard Hartwell, the manufacturing company's CEO who had bankrupted his own company. James Meridian, grandson of the company founder, who had turned his grandfather's legacy into a criminal enterprise. "This is enough," Marcus said. "This is enough to put them all in prison. If we can get it to the right people without being killed first." Victoria leaned back in her chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "Elena has been feeding this information to federal investigators for months, but it keeps getting buried. Someone inside the system is protecting Meridian Financial." "Then we go outside the system," Marcus said. "We take it to the press, to social media, to anyone who will listen. We make it impossible to ignore." Victoria nodded, but Marcus could see the doubt in her eyes. They both knew how easy it was for powerful people to discredit inconvenient truths, to destroy the credibility of anyone who threatened their interests. "There's one more thing," Victoria said, pulling out a final document from the envelope. "Elena found this in David Morrison's personal effects. His sister only discovered it recently, hidden in a book he had given her for Christmas." Marcus looked at the document, recognizing it immediately. It was a medical examiner's report, the official autopsy findings for David Morrison. But there were handwritten notes in the margins, questions and observations that hadn't made it into the final official report. "The medical examiner had doubts," Marcus said, reading the notations. He questioned whether the drugs in David's system could have been self-administered. "Look at this note," Victoria said, pointing to a passage highlighted in yellow. "The injection site was inconsistent with self-administration. The angle and depth suggested someone else had administered the drugs. Marcus felt his heart racing as he absorbed the implications. David Morrison was murdered. He didn't overdose. He was injected with a lethal combination of drugs by someone else. And the official report was changed to hide that fact. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the evidence overwhelming. This wasn't just financial fraud anymore. This was conspiracy, murder, and cover-up at the highest levels of corporate and government power. "We need help," Marcus said finally. "We can't do this alone." Victoria pulled out her phone, checking for signal bars. "Elena Morrison, we need to contact her directly. Let her know what happened tonight. She'll have resources, contacts, ways to get this information to people who can act on it." It took several tries to get a connection from the cabin, but eventually Victoria managed to reach Elena Morrison through an encrypted messaging app. The conversation was brief but intense. Elena's relief at hearing from Victoria mixed with alarm when she learned about the attack at Meridian Financial. "She's sending someone to pick us up," Victoria said after ending the call. "A federal agent who's been working with her unofficially to build a case against Meridian. Can we trust them?" "Elena seems to think so. Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. She's been investigating pension fund fraud for 3 years, but she's been blocked by her supervisors every time she gets close to Meridian Financial." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Martinez. Unusual for an FBI agent to be working unofficially." "Elena thinks there are people inside the Bureau who are protecting Meridian, just like everywhere else. Agent Martinez has been building a parallel case using unofficial channels, waiting for enough evidence to bypass the usual command structure." They spent the next hour organizing the files, making copies of the most critical documents, preparing for whatever came next. Marcus found himself thinking about Emma, sleeping safely at home, unaware that her father was about to risk everything again for the sake of justice. "I need to call her," Marcus said, holding up his phone. "Emma, I need to make sure she's okay." Victoria nodded. "Of course." The call went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual since Emma's phone was turned off at night. But when Marcus tried calling Janet, their elderly neighbor who sometimes helped with childcare, there was no answer there either. A cold knot formed in Marcus's stomach. Something's wrong. He tried calling his building superintendent, then the night clerk at the corner store where Janet sometimes shopped. No answer from any of them, as if an entire neighborhood had suddenly gone silent. "They're not there," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "Emma, Janet, everyone. They're gone." Victoria looked up from the files she had been organizing. Maybe they evacuated the building. Maybe there was a gas leak or something. Marcus was already moving toward the door. Or maybe Meridian Financial decided to take hostages to make sure we don't use those files. The drive back to Philadelphia passed in tense silence, Marcus pushing the old Honda harder than it was designed to go, while Victoria tried unsuccessfully to reach Elena Morrison or Agent Martinez. The city lights appeared on the horizon like a false dawn, promising answers that might come too late. Marcus's apartment building looked normal from the outside, no signs of evacuation or emergency. But when he used his key to enter, the silence felt wrong, too complete for a building that usually hummed with life, even in the early morning hours. Emma's room was empty, her bed neatly made, her stuffed animals arranged exactly as she always left them. But there was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened or where she might have been taken. Marcus found the note on his pillow, written in elegant handwriting on expensive stationery. "Mr. Chen, your daughter and Mrs. Holloway are safe and comfortable. They will remain so as long as you return what you took from us tonight. Bring the files to Meridian Financial Tower, 37th floor conference room, before 8 a.m. Come alone." The note was signed with a single initial, M. Marcus felt something break inside him, the careful control he had maintained throughout the night finally shattered by the realization that his fight for justice had put his daughter in danger. "They have Emma," he said, his voice hollow. Victoria read the note over his shoulder. "We can't give them the files. If we do, Emma won't be the only child who suffers. There are hundreds of families depending on us to expose the truth." "I don't care about hundreds of families," Marcus said, his voice rising. "I care about my daughter." "I know," Victoria said softly. "But giving them the files won't save her. It will just make sure that no one is ever held accountable for what they've done. And Emma will grow up in a world where powerful people can steal and murder without consequences. Marcus knew she was right, but the knowledge felt like acid in his throat. Everything he had worked for since losing his medical career had been focused on protecting Emma, providing for her, keeping her safe from the chaos that had destroyed his old life. Now his choice to fight for justice had made her a target. "There has to be another way," he said. Victoria was already reaching for her phone. "There is. We give them copies of some of the files, enough to buy time while Elena and Agent Martinez move to arrest them. We make them think they're getting what they want while we're actually setting a trap." The plan was risky, depending on split-second timing and the cooperation of federal agents who were working outside official channels. But it was the only chance they had to save Emma while still exposing the truth about the Hartwell pension fund and the murders that had covered it up. As dawn broke over Philadelphia, Marcus and Victoria prepared to return to Meridian Financial Tower, this time not as fugitives, but as hunters closing in on their prey. The question was whether they could spring their trap before Meridian Financial realized what was happening and decided that Emma Chen was too dangerous to let live. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plaza in front of Meridian Financial Tower, as Marcus and Victoria sat in the Honda, watching the building come alive with the daily rhythm of corporate power. Executives in expensive suits hurried through the revolving doors, their faces focused on phones and tablets, oblivious to the life and death drama about to unfold in the glass monument above them. Marcus checked his watch. 7:45 a.m. 15 minutes until the deadline, 15 minutes to save his daughter and expose the truth that had cost so many people their lives. His hands trembled slightly as he held the manila envelope containing copies of some of Elena Morrison's files, enough to make Meridian's executives think they were getting what they wanted while federal agents moved into position around the building. "Agent Martinez is in place," Victoria said, checking her encrypted phone. "Elena's contacts at the FBI are ready to move as soon as we confirm Emma's location." Marcus nodded, but his focus was entirely on the 37th floor, where somewhere behind those reflective windows, his 7-year-old daughter was being held hostage by people who had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. "If something goes wrong," he said quietly, "if this doesn't work." "It will work," Victoria said firmly. "We're going to get Emma back, and we're going to make sure that everyone responsible for stealing those pension funds pays for what they've done." Marcus looked at this woman who had transformed his life in the space of 12 hours, who had shown him that his principles weren't a weakness, but a strength, that fighting for justice wasn't a luxury, but a necessity. Victoria Sterling, who had risked everything to expose corruption, who understood that some things were worth dying for. "Whatever happens up there," Marcus said, "I want you to know that meeting you changed something in me. You reminded me of who I used to be, who I still am underneath all the fear and compromise." Victoria smiled, the expression transforming her tired face into something radiant. "You saved my life, Marcus. Not just in that stairwell, but by showing me that there are still people willing to do the right thing even when it costs them everything." They entered the building through the main lobby, past security guards who recognized Marcus but didn't question his presence during daylight hours. The elevator ride to the 37th floor felt endless, each floor marking another step toward a confrontation that would either vindicate years of suffering or destroy what little remained of Marcus's world. The executive conference room looked different in daylight, the oil paintings and leather furniture somehow less imposing under the harsh fluorescent lights. But the atmosphere was electric with tension as Marcus and Victoria entered to find 3 people waiting for them. James Meridian sat at the head of the conference table like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit tailored to perfection. He was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 55, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from a lifetime of never being told no. Beside him stood Richard Hartwell, the failed CEO whose greed had started this entire nightmare, nervousness evident in his shifting posture and darting eyes. But it was the third person who made Marcus's blood run cold. Chief Financial Officer Tyler Brigham, the man who had orchestrated the removal of Bernard Kellerman in one of the inspiration stories, stood near the windows with his arms crossed, studying Marcus and Victoria like specimens under a microscope. Dr. Marcus Chen, Brigham said, his voice carrying a note of amusement. Yes, we know exactly who you are. The disgraced physician who lost everything because he couldn't accept that some truths are too expensive to pursue. Where is my daughter? Marcus demanded, fighting to keep his voice steady. Safe, James Meridian replied, his tone conversational. For now. She's actually quite charming, your Emma. Reminds me of my own granddaughter at that age, full of questions, full of trust in adults to protect her. The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke. Marcus forced himself to remain calm, to stick to the plan even as every instinct screamed at him to tear the room apart until he found Emma. You have what we asked for? Hartwell asked, his voice shaky with the kind of desperation that came from being in over his head. Victoria stepped forward, holding up a manila envelope. Bank records, transfer receipts, correspondence, everything Elena Morrison gathered about the Hartwell pension fund theft. Not theft, Brigham corrected smoothly. Reallocation of assets to prevent total loss during corporate restructuring. Perfectly legal, if complex. Murder isn't legal, Marcus said. William Chen, David Morrison, the journalist who was investigating your operations. How many people did you kill to cover up your crimes? Meridian's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. Accidents happen, Dr. Chen. Industrial mishaps, drug overdoses, car crashes. The world is full of tragedy for those who aren't careful enough to avoid it. Like what happened to you, Brigham added, studying Marcus with cold calculation. A promising medical career destroyed because you asked the wrong questions about David Morrison's death. We tried to teach you the value of discretion, but some people never learn. The admission hung in the room like a confession. They had orchestrated his destruction, used David Morrison's death as a weapon to destroy anyone who might expose the truth. Marcus felt 5 years of buried rage rising in his chest, but he forced it down, focusing on what mattered most. The files, he said, gesturing for Victoria to place the envelope on the table. Now let me see my daughter. Meridian nodded to someone Marcus couldn't see, and a door at the far end of the conference room opened. Emma walked in, looking small and frightened but unharmed, followed by Janet Holloway, who moved with the careful dignity of someone trying not to show fear. Daddy! Emma ran toward Marcus, but Brigham stepped into her path, his hand resting on her shoulder like a gentle restraint that carried the weight of absolute threat. Not quite yet, little one, he said with false kindness. We need to make sure your father understands the new rules first. Marcus felt his control slipping, the sight of his daughter in danger overwhelming every rational thought. But Victoria caught his arm, her grip reminding him that rushing forward would only make things worse. The rules are simple, Meridian continued, opening the envelope and scanning the documents inside. You forget everything you think you know about pension fund management and corporate restructuring. You go back to your security guard job and your quiet little life, and you never speak to journalists or federal agents or anyone else who might be interested in ancient history. And if we refuse? Victoria asked. Brigham's hand tightened slightly on Emma's shoulder, and the little girl winced. Then Emma and Mrs. Holloway joined the list of people who've had unfortunate accidents, and you two followed them shortly after. The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, but Marcus could see the calculation behind it. These weren't desperate criminals acting on impulse. They were corporate executives who had turned murder into a business decision, who weighed human lives against profit margins and found the lives wanting. You can't kill everyone who threatens you, Victoria said, her voice steady despite the danger. Elena Morrison has copies of everything. Federal agents are building cases. The truth is going to come out eventually. Perhaps, Meridian acknowledged, but truth is a remarkably flexible concept when you have sufficient resources to shape it. Elena Morrison is a grieving sister, whose conspiracy theories about her brother's death have made her unstable and unreliable. You're a forensic accountant with a history of making unfounded accusations against respectable businesses. Dr. Chen is a disgraced physician whose medical license was revoked for gross incompetence. He stood up from the table, walking to the windows that looked out over the city. The beauty of our system, you see, is that credibility is a commodity like any other. It can be bought, sold, or destroyed depending on market conditions. And right now, the market value of your credibility is precisely zero. Marcus looked at his daughter, seeing the fear in her eyes, but also something else. Trust. Emma believed that her father would save her, that the man she knew as a security guard who helped people would find a way to make things right. She had no idea that he had once been a doctor, that he had lost everything fighting this same kind of corruption, that he was about to risk her life for principles she was too young to understand. "There's something you should know," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone in the room pause. "About those files you're holding." Meridian looked up from the documents, a frown creasing his perfect features. "What about them?" "They're incomplete," Victoria said, understanding immediately what Marcus was doing. "Those are just the financial records. The real evidence is what Elena Morrison found in David Morrison's personal effects." "What evidence?" Hartwell demanded, his nervousness spiking into panic. Marcus reached into his jacket, moving slowly to avoid triggering any violent response from Brigham. He pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind that doctors use to dictate notes, and placed it on the conference table. "David Morrison recorded his conversation with the person who killed him," Marcus said, the lie rolling off his tongue with the smooth confidence of someone who had spent years giving medical testimony. "He knew he was in danger, so he carried this recorder everywhere. Elena found it hidden in his room after he died." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic far below. Marcus could see the calculation running behind Meridian's eyes, weighing the possibility that David Morrison had left behind evidence of his own murder. "Play it," Brigham demanded, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Marcus reached for the recorder, his finger hovering over the play button. "Emma needs to leave the room first. She shouldn't hear this." "No," Meridian said sharply. "Everyone stays exactly where they are." "Then you'll have to explain to a 7-year-old child why you killed her grandfather," Victoria said, her voice carrying a tone of moral authority that cut through the corporate doublespeak like a knife. Hartwell looked confused. "What grandfather?" "William Chen," Marcus said, watching the recognition dawn in the older man's eyes. "Emma's grandfather on her mother's side. The Hartwell manufacturing worker who started asking questions about missing pension payments. The man you had killed to keep your theft quiet." Emma looked up at Brigham with sudden understanding, her young mind processing the implication that this man had hurt someone in her family. "You hurt Grandpa William?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "No one hurt anyone, sweetheart," Brigham said, but his attempt at reassurance sounded hollow even to him. "Your grandfather had an accident at work." "Liar," Emma said with the devastating honesty of childhood. "Daddy says lying is what bad people do when they're scared." The innocence of the accusation hit harder than any legal brief or newspaper investigation could have. In the mouth of a 7-year-old child, the truth became undeniable. These were bad people, scared people, people who had hurt others to protect themselves. Marcus pressed play on the recorder, and the room filled with the sound of static. But before anyone could react to the obvious deception, the conference room doors burst open and federal agents poured in, weapons drawn, voices sharp with authority. "FBI, nobody move!" Agent Sarah Martinez led the team, her badge held high, her gun trained on Brigham as he released Emma and stepped back from the table. Behind her came Elena Morrison, her face set with the kind of determination that came from years of pursuing justice for her murdered brother. "James Meridian, Richard Hartwell, Tyler Brigham, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and murder," Martinez announced as agents moved to handcuff the 3 executives. "You have the right to remain silent." Emma ran to Marcus and he swept her into his arms, holding her tight enough to reassure himself that she was real and safe and unharmed. Over her head, he met Victoria's eyes and saw his own relief and exhaustion reflected there. "How?" Meridian demanded as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "How did you know?" Elena Morrison stepped forward, holding up a tablet that showed the conference room from multiple angles. "Because we've been watching you for months, recording everything, waiting for you to incriminate yourselves. David always said the truth has a way of coming out if you're patient enough to wait for it." "The recorder was empty," Brigham said, his composure finally cracking. "There was no recording." Marcus smiled grimly. "No, but there didn't need to be. We had something better than David Morrison's voice from beyond the grave," We had you talking about industrial accidents and drug overdoses and car crashes. We had you threatening my daughter and admitting to covering up murders. Agent Martinez approached Marcus and Victoria, her expression professional but not unkind. We're going to need full statements from both of you. This case is going to trial, and your testimony will be crucial to getting convictions. What about the pension fund? Victoria asked. The money that was stolen from the workers? We've already frozen the offshore accounts, Elena Morrison said, her voice filled with satisfaction. $87 million plus interest and penalties. It's going back to the people it was stolen from. Marcus looked around the conference room at the oil paintings of Meridian's founders and the leather chairs that had hosted so many discussions of profit and loss. In a few hours, this would all be evidence in a federal prosecution, the corporate shrine transformed into a crime scene. Mrs. Chen, Agent Martinez said, approaching Janet Holloway, who had remained quietly dignified throughout the entire confrontation. Are you all right? Do you need medical attention? Janet straightened her shoulders with the kind of pride that came from surviving 7 decades of life's challenges. I'm fine, dear. These old bones have been through worse than a few hours with some scared executives. As the federal agents led Meridian, Hartwell, and Brigham away in handcuffs, Marcus found himself standing at the conference room windows, looking out over the city with Emma in his arms. The sun was higher now, the morning rush hour giving way to the steady rhythm of a business day that would continue regardless of the corporate empire that had just collapsed. Daddy, Emma said quietly, are you really a doctor? Marcus looked down at his daughter's face, seeing the intelligence and curiosity that reminded him so much of himself at her age. I used to be, a long time ago. Why did you stop? The question hung in the air, simple and profound. Marcus thought about the easy answers he could give, the way he could shield her from the complexity of adult corruption and moral compromise. But Emma deserved better than lies, even comfortable ones. Because some bad people didn't want me to help sick patients anymore, he said finally. They made it so I couldn't work as a doctor, so I had to find another way to help people. Like being a security guard? Like being a security guard. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness of someone much older. Do you miss it? Being a doctor? Marcus looked out at the city, thinking about the years he had spent walking these halls as an invisible guardian, the way he had convinced himself that survival was enough, that protecting what little he had was more important than fighting for what was right. I did miss it, he said, but I think I'm ready to try again. Victoria approached them, her own expression thoughtful. Agent Martinez says the federal prosecutor's office is looking for expert witnesses in medical fraud cases, someone with both clinical experience and first-hand knowledge of how corruption works in healthcare systems. The offer hung in the air like a bridge between Marcus's past and his future, a chance to reclaim not just his medical career, but his sense of purpose. It wouldn't be easy. There would be paperwork, retraining, the long process of rebuilding a reputation that had been systematically destroyed. But for the first time in years, it felt possible. What about Meridian Financial? Marcus asked. What happens to the building, the company? Federal seizure, Elena Morrison said, joining their conversation. All assets frozen pending trial. The building will probably be sold, the proceeds used to compensate fraud victims. Marcus thought about the night security guards who would lose their jobs, the cleaning crews who would have to find new employment, the invisible workers who kept the machinery of corporate power functioning. They hadn't chosen to work for criminals, but they would pay the price for corporate crimes they had no part in planning. I have an idea about that, Victoria said, as if reading his thoughts. The federal government usually sells seized assets through public auction, but there's precedent for transferring them to community organizations, especially when it serves the interests of justice. What kind of community organization? Victoria smiled, the expression transforming her exhaustion into something that looked almost like hope. A workers' cooperative, employee-owned, democratically managed, focused on serving the community instead of extracting profit from it. We could turn Meridian Financial Tower into something Thomas Hartwell would have been proud of. The vision was ambitious, perhaps impossible, but Marcus found himself imagining it. a 40-story building dedicated to serving working families instead of exploiting them, offices full of people fighting for economic justice instead of corporate profits, a monument to the possibility that business could be a force for good in the world. "You'd need someone to manage the transition," he said. "Someone who understands both the corporate world and the community that's been harmed by it." "I'd need a partner," Victoria replied. "Someone with integrity, intelligence, and the kind of moral courage that's willing to fight even when the odds are impossible." Emma looked up at her father with eyes that seemed to see everything. "Daddy, are you going to help Miss Victoria save more people?" Marcus looked at his daughter, this remarkable little person who had survived kidnapping with more dignity than most adults showed in ordinary circumstances. She deserved to grow up in a world where doing the right thing was rewarded instead of punished, where people like William Chen and David Morrison didn't have to die for caring about justice. "Yes," Marcus said, the word carrying the weight of a promise. "We're going to help save a lot of people." Agent Martinez approached them with a stack of paperwork and an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal relief. "The arraignments are scheduled for tomorrow morning. All 3 defendants are being held without bail, their flight risks with access to offshore accounts and no ties to the community." "What about the other cases?" Elena Morrison asked. "The other pension funds, the other companies that might be involved in similar fraud?" "This is just the beginning," Martinez replied. "Meridian Financial was part of a network that stretches across multiple states. We're going to need years to unravel all of it, and we're going to need people willing to testify, to serve as expert witnesses, to help us understand how these systems work." Marcus felt the familiar pull of purpose, the sense that his skills and experience could serve something larger than his own survival. It would mean more risk, more exposure to the kind of powerful people who had destroyed his career once before. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. "Count us in," he said, speaking for himself and Victoria without needing to ask permission. As they left Meridian Financial Tower for the last time, Marcus carried Emma while Victoria walked beside them, the manila envelope of evidence clutched in her hands like a talisman. Behind them, federal agents continued the process of dismantling a corporate empire built on theft and murder, while ahead of them lay the uncertain but hopeful prospect of building something better. "Daddy," Emma said as they reached the plaza outside the building, "can we go home now?" Marcus looked around at the city stretching in all directions, full of people struggling to make honest livings in a system that seemed designed to reward dishonesty and punish integrity. Home wasn't just the small apartment in South Philadelphia anymore. It was wherever they were working to make the world a little more just, a little more fair, a little more worthy of children like Emma. "Yes, sweetheart," Marcus said, holding his daughter close while Victoria walked beside them toward whatever came next. "We're going home." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the lobby of the building that had once been Meridian Financial Tower, watching as workers installed new signage that read, "Thomas Hartwell Community Financial Center." The federal seizure had been completed, the trials had resulted in lengthy prison sentences for all 3 executives, and the long process of transformation had begun. The building still looked the same from the outside, 40 stories of glass and steel reaching toward the sky. But inside, everything had changed. Where corporate executives had once plotted to steal pension funds, community organizers now worked to establish credit unions and financial literacy programs. Where lawyers had once crafted legal schemes to hide fraud, social workers now helped families navigate bankruptcy and foreclosure. And in the medical clinic on the 3rd floor, Dr. Marcus Chen saw patients who couldn't afford traditional health care, using the skills that had once been taken from him to serve the community that had sustained him during his darkest years. "Dr. Chen," a young nurse approached, holding a chart. "Your next patient is here, Margaret Chen, 70 years old, presenting with chest pains." Marcus looked up from the medical journal he had been reading, his heart skipping a beat at the familiar name. "Margaret Chen. Is she related to—" "She says she's your mother," the nurse replied with a smile. "Says she's proud of her son, the doctor, even if it took him a while to remember who he was supposed to be." Marcus walked toward the examination room, thinking about the journey that had brought him back to medicine, back to himself, back to the conviction that healing people mattered more than protecting himself from the consequences of caring. It had been Victoria who suggested the clinic, Victoria who helped secure the federal funding, Victoria who worked alongside him every day to turn idealism into practical action. Emma was in school now, at the community center on the building's second floor, learning alongside children whose parents worked in the credit union and the legal aid office, and the dozens of other organizations that had found homes in the transformed tower. She knew her father was a doctor again, knew he had once lost everything fighting for people like her grandfather William, knew that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with principles. The building still hummed with activity, but it was a different kind of energy now. Instead of the cold calculation of profit maximization, there was the warm bustle of people working together to solve problems, to build community, to create the kind of world they wanted their children to inherit. Marcus opened the door to examination room 3 and found his mother sitting on the edge of the table, her back straight despite her 70 years, her eyes bright with the same intelligence that had driven her to work multiple jobs to put him through medical school. "Hello, Mom," he said, washing his hands and pulling on latex gloves with the practiced efficiency of someone who had never really stopped being a doctor. "What brings you in today?" Margaret Chen smiled at her son, the expression carrying decades of pride and worry and unconditional love. "Just wanted to see how my boy was settling back into his real job," she said, "and maybe get these chest pains checked out while I'm here." Marcus began his examination, his hands gentle and professional, as he listened to his mother's heart, checked her blood pressure, asked the questions that would help him understand what was causing her discomfort. But part of his mind was on the larger miracle of this moment. A mother and son, reunited not just as family but as patient and healer, in a building that had been transformed from a monument to greed into a center of community service. "Your heart sounds strong," Marcus said, completing the examination, "but I think we should run an EKG and some blood work, just to be safe." "Whatever you think is best, Dr. Chen," Margaret replied, the title carrying all the weight of dreams deferred and finally realized. As Marcus prepared the testing equipment, he thought about Victoria, who was somewhere in the building working on the next phase of their mission, expanding the community financial model to other cities, other seized corporate assets, other communities that had been harmed by the kind of corruption they had exposed at Meridian. They had become partners in every sense that mattered, professional colleagues, moral allies, and something deeper that neither of them had quite put into words, but both understood perfectly. Victoria had shown him that his principles weren't a weakness, but a source of strength, that fighting for justice wasn't a luxury, but a necessity, that some things were worth risking everything to protect. And he had shown her that heroes didn't always wear suits or carry briefcases, that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people like security guards and forensic accountants, single parents and elderly factory workers, invisible people who chose to become visible when visibility was dangerous. The story that had begun with Marcus waking up to find an injured CEO in his arms had become something neither of them could have imagined. A transformation, not just of their own lives, but of an entire system, a proof that ordinary people armed with extraordinary courage could change the world in ways that mattered. Emma would grow up knowing that her father was a man who helped people, who fought for justice, who never stopped believing that doing the right thing was more important than staying safe. She would inherit a world that was still imperfect, still unfair, still full of people who chose profit over principles. But she would also inherit the knowledge that change was possible, that corruption could be exposed, that even the most powerful criminals could be brought to justice when ordinary people decided to stop being invisible and start being heroes. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.